Let me welcome you all to the IISS. It's a pleasure to see so many of you here for this evening's event. My name is Bastian Giegerich. I'm the Director of Defense and Military Analysis here at the Institute, and it's my pleasure to introduce Ben Barry, our Senior Fellow for Land Warfare here at the IISS. We want to speak this evening about hybrid warfare, the conflict in Ukraine, and the war against ISIS. Two obviously very important subjects brought together under one heading. We have, as you hopefully know, as an institute, done quite a bit of work around the theme of hybrid warfare in our armed conflict survey, in strategic survey, and of course also in the military balance and in our journal Survival. A lot of that work has, by necessity, looked at this phenomenon from quite a, I guess one could say, strategic angle, strategic point of view. And this evening we want to drill down a little deeper and look at some of the military assessments and tactical assessments that one can make around these conflicts. And it's my pleasure to introduce Ben, who will lead us through this conversation. Ben, as I said, is the Senior Fellow for Land Warfare here at the IISS, has spent a long and distinguished career in the British Army in a variety of roles, too numerous to go through here, but you have of course his information on the invitation. Ben will speak for roughly half an hour, and we will try and bring this in around 7 p.m. so that we have half an hour for discussion after Ben has given us his thoughts. And I will not steal more of our time. Ben, please, the floor is yours. Over to you. And again, a very warm welcome to everybody. Ben.
Now, both the conflicts are often described as hybrid wars. So I'm going to look selectively at each, but from a military point of view, share with you my emerging military assessments, and also some more general points about what both wars tell us about contemporary conflict. There'll be lots I won't talk about, but I'd welcome questions on anything I've said or what I haven't said. So let's start with the sophisticated Russian operation to take over the Crimea, which was led by its Spetsnaz, its special forces, and elite airborne and naval infantry. And their tactics saw rapid deployment, electronic warfare, and a lot of security and deception. The Russians used the term maskirovka. It included a multifaceted information campaign targeted as much at domestic as foreign audiences, where continual denials and rebuttals from Moscow that it was militarily involved, even if they became increasingly implausible, created cognitive dissonance both in the Ukrainian government and in foreign decision-making circles. And the concurrent rapid mobilization, which brought a reported 40,000 Russian troops to assembly areas close to Ukraine, proceeded smoothly. And similar snap inspections have continued, some of which have been huge in scale. Now, both sides in the Crimea sought to avoid the use of force. Russia may have been aided by its intelligence agencies' penetration of various parts of the Ukrainian state and Ukrainian forces. The Russians' highly restrictive rules of engagement and apparently high standard of discipline showed that these were better led and better trained troops than had fought in Afghanistan or Chechnya. And the apparently rapid formulation of an imaginative concept of operations and rapid execution of the plan, apparently devised at relatively short notice, suggests that Russia retains the capability that it forged from 1942 onwards of a cadre of competent strategic and operational level military planners, as well as an aptitude for deception. But most Russian combat capability was not tested in 2014, but the success of the Crimea operation certainly boosted the domestic standing and the morale of the Russian armed forces. Now, we've subsequently seen fighting in eastern Ukraine. A key question is, why have the Ukrainian government been unable to suppress the insurgency by pro-Russian separatists in East Ukraine? Firstly, it seems that the separatists have exploited grievances held by the people of eastern Ukraine, not least those arising from corruption and economic mismanagement. Secondly, a combination of underinvestment and corruption 25 years ago, the Ukrainian and Russian forces were both part of the same force, the Red Army. Since then, the Ukraine consistently underinvested in defence, and corruption weakened the Ukrainian security sector. Now, both sides have employed conventional military tactics, reflective not only of their shared military heritage, but also the increasingly bitter nature of the conflict. Civilian suffering has been profound. Ukraine's military appears to have made little effort to conduct what NATO, after Afghanistan, would recognise as counterinsurgency. Both government and separatist forces have made widespread use of artillery and shell fire during operations amid civilian population centres. Now, if we turn the clock back to last autumn, or the autumn about a year ago, the Ukrainian government offensive at the end of summer 2014 was achieving some success in pushing the separatists back, but it was stopped in its tracks by Russian intervention, particularly by professionally applied artillery and rocket fire. Since then, Ukrainian government forces have lost information superiority and artillery superiority, and we see drones and signals intelligence triggering mortar, artillery and rocket attacks or heavy jamming on Ukrainian forces, especially headquarters. And when this has been combined with tank and infantry attacks, separatist combined arms attacks have overwhelmed defending government troops. Classic combined arms tactics with a 21st century twist. And what does the subsequent fighting in eastern Ukraine tell us about Russian capability? Well, it's difficult to tell how much of the military effects achieved by the separatists were on their own, were separatists with Russian training, separatists with Russian advice and assistance, or by formed Russian subunits or units. Though there are vignettes and snapshots. For example, it's quite clear that a formed Russian tank battalion took part in the fighting in the early part of the year, including the battle around Debaltseve. But I'd like to share with you some emerging observations. Now, this is a Ukrainian government MTLB, armoured personnel carrier, and it had an anti-aircraft gun mounted on top of it. Nothing particularly new. But the military professionals amongst you will notice that that has been comprehensively shelled. You can tell the amount of earth and rocks that spread out all over the top of the vehicle. And it's quite clear that the Russian and the separatist artillery know their business, not just on their own, but also as part of the combined arms battle. And they've made some use of long-range rockets for depth battle. They're able to use intelligence, surveillance and reconnaissance, particularly from drones and signals intelligence, to cue effective attacks, both indirect fire strikes, jamming, or indeed tactical ground offensives. They're also able to create an effective layered air defence, albeit against what's left of the relatively unmodernised Ukrainian government air force. The Russians have been able to move battalions and brigades effectively and quickly by rail, with no apparent disruption to Russian civilian rail services, and evidence that the 4 railway transport brigades that Russia retains in its order of battle know their stuff. So the strategic decision taken in 2008 to embark on a comprehensive modernisation programme, as well as significantly increasing defence expenditure, has probably, in the eyes of the Russian leadership and Russian people, been validated. It will be interesting to see what lessons they take away from these operations and what adjustments they make. Now, currently, from a military point of view, the conflict in the Ukraine seems pretty frozen, but with a degree of implementation of the Minsk II agreement and the Office for Security and Cooperation in Europe doing a manful job as a peace monitoring force, something it was never really designed for. And despite the large pro-Western majority in the parliament in Kiev, the popular mandate from the Maidan revolution, and the existential threat from Moscow, Ukraine's political establishment has been troubled by infighting and struggles to reform the country. Now, if we've got a stalemate on the battlefield, it may be because of a military balance. It may be that without direct Russian support, the rebels would struggle to make further progress. And any government offensives from the other side that achieved operational impact on the separatists would likely trigger another Russian intervention, with resulting government forces casualties. So we may be seeing a rough and ready military stalemate with a degree of mutual deterrence. moving on to cover ISIS or Daesh. In our publications over the last 2 years, we've explained how Prime Minister Maliki consolidated his power, including by marginalising and persecuting key Sunni and Kurd politicians, and a toxic combination of discrimination, deliberate neglect, and increasingly heavy-handed repression of an increasingly disenfranchised and disaffected Sunni minority. And of course, in the meantime, the remnants of al-Qaeda in Iraq took up arms against the Assad regime in Syria, rebranding itself as ISIS, carving out territory from the central town of Raqqa to the Iraqi border. And of course, it imposed a brutal version of Sharia, but it also sought to achieve stability in the towns it controlled, to generate revenue from taxes, kidnappings, and black market trading of oil and looted antiquities. It also rebuilt its networks in the increasingly discontented Sunni communities across western and central Iraq. As documented in its 2 glossy annual reports, it used bombings, assassinations, and guerrilla attacks on Iraqi government forces, and mounted sophisticated propaganda, including well-edited videos on YouTube, a highly effective Twitter operation, and all of that was to garner international volunteers, financial donations, and support from Syrian and Iraqi Sunnis. And 18 months ago, in early 2014, it seized Fallujah, from which it was not dislodged. And over the following months, it gained an increasing advantage over Iraqi government forces around Mosul, and Iraqi senior commanders precipitate self-evacuation from the city, a polite way of saying they ran away, seems to have triggered a widespread Iraqi forces rout. Now, why did this all happen? In a word, corruption and cronyism ate the capability of the Iraqi security forces. From 2010 to 2014, for example, Maliki centralised control of security, directly assuming ministerial authority from the armed forces, police and intelligence agencies. Tried and tested police and army commanders with proven effectiveness were replaced by less capable but politically loyal proxies. So this reduced both the effectiveness of the Iraqi security forces and their impartiality. And endemic corruption further reduced the effectiveness of the army and police. And the many media reports in British, US and Iraqi media in mid-2014 of Iraqi army units with inadequate rations, water, ammunition and vehicles suggested that vast amounts of money and materiel had been stolen by corrupt officers and officials, eroding military capability, morale and fighting spirit. Throughout 2014, ISIS attacked the Iraqi state in 3 different ways. Firstly, it conducted an insurgency, and that was responsible for much of the early attrition of the Iraqi forces in and around Mosul. There were also, and still remain, ISIS insurgents active in Sunni communities in and around Baghdad, as well as Diyala province, and that greatly complicated and continues to complicate the security challenges faced by Baghdad. Secondly, ISIS used terrorist tactics to strike at government forces, institutions and Shia communities. This was propaganda of the deed, which acted to reinforce the image it wanted to portray of an Iraqi government that was failing and to also feed the fires of antagonism between Sunni and Shia. Thirdly, after the fall of Mosul, ISIS used conventional forces to push back Iraqi government and Peshmerga troops. For example, after the fall of Mosul, it fielded large numbers of fighters mounted in civilian vehicles and captured Iraqi army vehicles, including pickup trucks and 4x4s mounted with an assortment of heavy weapons, the so-called technicals. It's clear that ISIS troops actively conducted ground reconnaissance, as ISIS columns showed an impressive ability to find not just Iraqi government positions, but also to identify gaps between the positions and manoeuvre forces around them, to isolate the defenders, block supply lines, and frustrate government attempts to counterattack. Once ISIS's advance was halted the best part of a year ago in autumn 2014 and a front line established, marked on the Iraqi side by a ubiquitous berm of bulldozed earth, ISIS offensive operations reduced but did not cease, and this of course coincides with the US-led coalition air campaign ramping up. On a number of occasions over the last year in Iraq, ISIS commanders have been able to identify gaps or other vulnerabilities, sometimes infiltrating forces to the flanks or rear of Iraqi or Peshmerga positions, sometimes even crossing rivers to do so. And these, of course, were concurrent with continued ISIS attacks in Syria, both against government forces and less extreme Syrian opposition groups, that is, less extreme than ISIS. So overall, what we saw in 2014 was ISIS display an ability to advance on multiple fronts, use reconnaissance to inform its plans and create and exploit opportunities. So I think that's an indicator of capable military leadership with effective commanders. Now, over the last 9 months, ISIS has clearly been on the strategic defensive in Iraq, and the Pentagon is right when it says that ISIS has been pushed back about 25% of the Iraqi territory that it gained at its high water mark. But it's conducted a very active defence, mounting tactical counterattacks to disrupt its opponent's plans and close gaps in its own front line. And these offensives contribute to its propaganda by showing it to be a force in being that's still conquering territory, defeating government forces and killing apostates, even if it's overall losing territory. For example, take Ramadi. It had actually been seeking to capture Ramadi since June 2014, and several attacks were made but beaten off by government forces and Sunni tribes fighting on Baghdad's side. But from April 2015, it mounted a coordinated offensive of wide-ranging shaping and diversionary attacks north and west of Baghdad. And in May 2015, Iraqi government forces were tactically overmatched by ISIS, possibly taking advantage of a sandstorm. And the Iraqi forces seemed to rapidly withdraw in a state of some disorder. Now, this shows that ISIS is capable of sequencing its attacks in space and time to distract and deceive its opponents. It also shows that since the start of the US-led coalition airstrikes, it's shown that it has adapted its tactics and campaign design to allow it to move and concentrate forces for those attacks without them being destroyed by air power. So ISIS actually practices manoeuvre and combined arms tactics, but not quite as taught at Warminster or Fort Leavenworth. I've spoken about their ground reconnaissance. We can also see in Syria and Iraq, ISIS display a common approach to attacking government positions. And once they're identified, they're initially subject to indirect fire from mortars, rockets, and sometimes captured artillery pieces for a day or days. And these indirect fire attacks serve to destroy fighting positions, weapons, soft-skinned and lightly armoured vehicles. They reduce the morale of the defenders, many of whom appear to have neither been trained to prepare conventional field fortifications, nor have sufficiently capable leaders to counter the resulting fear. Now, in the final stages of the attack, there's an assault, often from multiple directions. Heavy weapons on technicals and sometimes captured armoured vehicles provide direct fire support, and we've seen videos of them actually seeing off Iraqi government helicopters that have attempted to come to the rescue of the position. And the close assault usually begins with suicide bomb attacks to make breaches in the physical defences of the position. And these are increasingly used en masse and include captured armoured vehicles filled with explosives. And in recent attacks, we've seen ISIS deploy an armoured engineer capability using excavators and bulldozers fitted with improvised armour to breach the berms, and they're also filled with explosives for eventual suicide detonation. And this is a civilian piece of earth-moving equipment with improvised armour by ISIS that was actually captured by the Peshmerga 6 or 9 months ago. And finally, there's an infantry attack by ISIS fighters, sometimes led by waves of relatively expendable, less capable foreign volunteers. The assault force invariably includes ISIS combat cameramen filming the destruction, carnage, and any subsequent executions to be exploited by ISIS's propaganda operation. And having watched the video that this particular clip came from, it's pretty clear to me that the 2 armoured vehicles there, which are burning, had actually been knocked out by ISIS artillery fire. So the fall of Ramadi, as an example, played into ISIS strategy by establishing a caliphate in being that has much of the apparatus of a state. It seized the jihadist narrative from al-Qaeda and inspired its own followers. And ISIS's propaganda and operations are intertwined at every level, from the tactical to the strategic. Now, where are we now with the wars in Syria and Iraq? Well, they're both very complicated, but we've seen ISIS's information operation sustaining and growing its support base, which in turn inspires recruits to travel to it, or violent extremists who can't or won't travel conduct attacks on ISIS's behalf in their own countries. For example, at this summer's IISS Shangri-La Dialogue in Singapore, leaders in Southeast Asia expressed considerable concern that ungoverned spaces could fall under the control of ISIS-inspired groups, and that also there were too many people travelling from Southeast Asia to the caliphate. And these facts on the ground have also motivated other violent extremists to attempt to hold ground, to construct outposts of the caliphate for themselves. We've seen this with Boko Haram, we see ISIS's supporters attempting to control terrain in Libya, and we now see an upsurge of people claiming to work for ISIS in eastern Afghanistan, particularly in Nangarhar province. Now, the members of the anti-ISIS coalition only have finite intelligence and surveillance resources, whether those are satellites, drones, or old-fashioned human intelligence teams. So these longer-range, extra-regional activities by ISIS and those inspired by it reduce the ability of the anti-ISIS coalition to contain it. You know, and there's some inconvenient truths from cold arithmetic. For example, if the number of new fighters joining ISIS's frontline forces is equal to or greater than those being killed or wounded in combat, the caliphate stands a good chance of being able to endure for some time. Now, we don't know how long or how intense Russia intends their intervention to be, but it's quite clear that what seems to be happening is the airstrikes are designed to shape the battlefield for an advance by Syrian troops accompanied by Iranian and Hezbollah advisors and possibly formed Hezbollah units to push back the rebels around Aleppo whilst mounting token airstrikes against ISIS. And it's quite interesting to have seen the Russian government information operation, which is quite modern in itself and is emphasising the small number of strikes against ISIS. It's also emphasising the use of modern high-tech precision weapons, although this is slightly undermined by lots of pictures of hard-working Russian ground crew in Syria loading dumb bombs onto the Russian aircraft, and indeed the multiple reporting from the Syrian opposition that it's mostly dumb bombs being used by the Russian jets. Now, the US-led international coalition against ISIS is frail, so ISIS will probably remain an enduring feature of the Middle East strategic landscape for some time. Now, the coalition is attempting to do all the right things, severing ISIS's lines of communication, limiting flow of foreign fighters, choking off financial support, attacking with precision its military organisation, and training local forces to confront it more effectively. That's all absolutely right. But the campaign is hampered by the absence of political solutions to the wars flaring in the region, particularly getting Sunnis in both Syria and Iraq on side, and the limitations, of course, of local forces. So in the immediate future, I think the most that can be expected is containment of the territorial reach of ISIS, awaiting on defeat of its autocratic and theocratic message, and more effective governance in areas liberated from its control, as well as some political alignment of the planets that makes things less rather than more difficult for the anti-ISIS coalition. Now, I'm just going to make some general points about the conflicts. Both have demonstrated the inherent unpredictability of war, in which the enemy has a vote and may fight to the death to cast it. It reminds us war is a clash of wills between actors seeking to shape events to suit their political aims. It's a political activity. And the combatants are seeking to gain and exploit all the advantages they can. And what you can see in both wars is attrition. You can see its opposite, which is manoeuvre. You can see symmetric and asymmetric military approaches in various combinations. The wars also demonstrate the enduring application of what British General JFC Fuller called the constant tactical factor, where every improvement in warfare is checked by a counter-improvement. They also show plenty of the examples of the factors that Clausewitz identified as distinguishing war from other activities: the effects of danger, the difficulty of gaining accurate information, the pervasive presence of friction, and war's political nature. Now, on top of that simple Clausewitzian model are overlaid multiple political and military conflicts, and pervasive electronic and social media used by all parties greatly accelerates the passage of information of various degrees of truth, falsehood and exaggeration. So what we're seeing is if someone's taken Clausewitz and laid on top of it Hobbes, Machiavelli, and then George R.R. Martin's Game of Thrones novels, has shredded them and then spun them in a powerful centrifuge and emptied them all over the theatre of war. And this interpenetration and interdependence of war and politics increases complexity and creates opportunities, risks and threats for all actors at every level. And General Petraeus has been quoted as saying, war is not a linear phenomenon, it's a calculus, not arithmetic. And the strategic, operational and tactical levels have often overlapped with a political dimension to tactical operations. For example, the fall of Ramadi was a tactical defeat with operational and strategic consequences, as was the fall of Debaltseve in Ukraine. And that's also the effect we've just observed with the successful, albeit temporary, Taliban capture of Kunduz in Afghanistan. Now, these two wars also tell us much about insurgency and counterinsurgency, reminding us that disadvantage, discrimination and repression are important root causes of insurgency. They show us that you can't get very far in counterinsurgency without an effective political strategy, and an unsophisticated security crackdown will tend to exacerbate the insurgency rather than suppress it. And if the insurgents are better at insurgency than the government is at counterinsurgency, the balance of advantage will shift to the insurgents. Some commentators, particularly in the Western media, have been surprised to discover in ISIS an insurgent movement that employs conventional forces. Well, clearly they've not studied insurgency much. I mean, Mao's theories of insurgencies forecast that the final and decisive phase of a revolutionary war would be the formation of an insurgent army, which would play the leading role in the final defeat of the enemy. And Ho Chi Minh's forces demonstrated this twice in practice in their two wars in Vietnam. So ISIS shows the potential value of an insurgent force that can multitask, that can conduct different types of war using different methods simultaneously in the same theatre. It also applies to government forces and intervening forces. They also conform to the proposition made by UK General Sir Rupert Smith in his 2005 book, The Utility of Force of War Amongst the People. And the use and utility of force is intertwined with politics at every level, from the local and tactical to the strategic. And they're both similarly intertwined with what we've come to call in the Institute a battle for the narrative. And this continues a trend that was already discernible from the Iraq and Afghan wars, as the increasing proliferation and diversification of modern media make them an ever more important part of the environment in which military operations are conducted, as will be the increasing speed with which events can be reported and messages formulated and transmitted. And this battle for the narrative will probably increasingly apply to operations conducted by conventional military forces. In some cases, the battle for narrative may be as important as the battle to destroy the enemy's secure terrain or even secure maritime or airspace. In some scenarios, it may be more important. And finally, some brief headlines about military capability. I mean, I think, if ever there was an illustration that corruption and nepotism eats military capability, we've had it from both wars. And it reinforces the value of competent and credible military leadership. Leadership can act as a multiplying factor to military effectiveness, albeit one that can be positive or negative. And both wars remind us also the value of an operational level leadership and command of a campaign and a combined arms approach to tactics, where the action of all the branches of an army, and for that matter an air force, are sequenced and integrated to produce a whole that's greater than the sum of the parts. We've seen a lot of work by special operations forces playing a leading role in the Russian takeover of the Crimea. Clearly they've played an important role in coalition operations against ISIS. We've also seen an interesting model of special forces, a non-Western model of special forces, and that is the deployment of advisors from the Iranian Republican Guard Quds Force, the secretive special operations and intelligence agency. Now, Quds Force had supported the special groups of Shia militia that fought the UK and US forces in the previous decade, albeit operating covertly. But in 2014, its presence was acknowledged by both Iran and the militias and the Peshmerga groups that it supported. Indeed, there's a 48-hour old selfie on a Twitter account taken by the previously secretive General Qasem Soleimani with Iraqi militias, just appeared on the internet. And in a sense, what you've got here is a sort of comprehensive approach model to special forces. Because as well as having advisors and doing special operations, and indeed what you might sometimes call state-sponsored terrorism, Quds Force is also the executive organ of the Iranian government that leads on policy for Iraq, Syria and the Lebanon. And I think that's quite an interesting model of what has fashionably been called the comprehensive approach. We've also seen the importance of air power and the value of precision munitions, but air power can only achieve so much unless it's got a credible partner on the surface to help it go forward. Otherwise, it's attrition, which eventually those on the receiving end will adapt to. And finally, for those of you who are interested in land warfare, I think we've seen a return to the roots to a certain extent. The wars in Iraq and Afghanistan saw the major casualty-producing agent of US, NATO and allied forces in Iraq and Afghanistan being the improvised explosive device, the roadside bomb. Well, in World War I and World War II, the principal cause of ground forces casualties was indirect fire, mortars, gun artillery and rockets. And it's an inconvenient truth, which is particularly inconvenient for NATO, that the Russians and Chinese have never lost sight of this. And actually, Russian and Chinese brigades contain twice as much artillery as NATO brigades. Well, I think I'll leave it there. I'm conscious there's a lot I haven't talked about, but I'd welcome your questions and comments, particularly if you've got better ideas.
Ben, thank you very much, and bang on time. So we've got a good half hour for conversation and discussion. We do have roving mics, so please, if you'd like to ask a question, make a comment, do catch my eye, and we'll have the microphone move towards you. And if you have the floor, if you would be so kind to briefly introduce yourself before you ask your question, make your comment, that would be fantastic. So please, yes, first question here in the middle, third row from the front. Yes, sir.
Charles Vivian, a member of the Institute. Ben, thank you very much for a very comprehensive, wide-ranging and profound review. Could I ask a question about the reaction of Allied forces to hybrid warfare, and how would NATO invoke Article 5 in a hybrid warfare situation? Let us posit, which I don't think will necessarily happen, that hybrid warfare was developed by Russian forces in the Baltic republics. How would we decide that actually war had been initiated in the Baltic republics and we should respond appropriately?
Well, I think the difficulty of the Ukrainian government and the international community of working out what the Russians were up to in Crimea shows how important intelligence, surveillance and reconnaissance is, but also linking intelligence, surveillance and reconnaissance to providing credible evidence of a smoking gun, which you can get out there into the battle of the narrative. Now, that is always difficult because of sensitivities regarding intelligence, but people have got to do better. And if you want a classic example of a missed opportunity, it's when US sources claimed that 4 of the Russian cruise missiles had crashed in Iran. If actually, as they claimed it, they'd released the satellite photos that showed this, their claim would have had some credibility. But as it is, you know, it's blown away in the wind. I think that the second thing that we've done quite some thinking about in the Institute is states that are vulnerable to hybrid warfare, they need to better inoculate themselves against hybrid warfare. Well, there's an internal political dimension of this. You know, if they've got a minority with genuine grievances, then the state should be doing what it could to tackle those genuine grievances. It can also improve its own internal security, its domestic intelligence service, its police service. And indeed, that is what I hope the countries that are friends of states who feel vulnerable to hybrid warfare should be doing. I think, though, once some sort of hybrid scenario breaks out, and we shouldn't assume that necessarily it's going to be a Crimea, little green men type scenario. It might be something that we can't imagine. You know, you can deduce some general conclusions. None of them are new. I mean, firstly, the importance of legitimacy. Secondly, the need for a political strategy, and one that can actually be applied in a way that makes a difference, not just at the strategic level, but the operational and tactical level. And then the need for a broad set of political development and intelligence capabilities that you can apply to this. And I think on the military side, what this reinforces is the need for a broad set of military capabilities, but particularly understanding and intelligence, in a way that connects, you know, the ultra-secret strategic intelligence to the people who are actually executing on the ground, but also to the information campaign. And also, I think what this tells you is that military forces and military commanders do need to be capable of multitasking in the same theatre of operations, you know, doing different things sequentially or simultaneously within the same force. But I wouldn't pretend that this is easy. But we do, I think, Bastian, it's fair to say, we have a sense that NATO and quite a few NATO countries are thinking pretty seriously about this.
Ben, thank you very much. So another question, second row from the back. Yes, please.
Hello, John Woodcock, Labour Member of Parliament for Bower and Furness. I just wondered, thank you, it was an excellent presentation. I wonder if you could just say a little bit more about the battle for the narrative, particularly from the side trying to counter what Russia has been doing, and provide the counterinsurgency narrative against Daesh. Clearly, there is much room for improvement. What could you say about that? And in particular, given the difficulty that we often have, one of the problems with the free media is they don't always write exactly what you want them to write, compared, for example, to Russia's comparative control of the state media.
Ben, while you answer that, I think I feel that there lurks a different aspect behind this, which is do we as trying to counter hybrid warfare, do we need to become hybrid warriors ourselves? Do we need to mirror basically these actions, or would that lead us down the wrong path? Just another dimension to this aspect around the battle of the narrative.
Well, no one said that this was going to be easy, and I think the effectiveness of both Russian messaging, but particularly Daesh messaging, has been a bit of a shock. I don't think that there's a need for an information operations campaign in conflicts like this, but it should be owned by the host nation. So in a sense, the Iraqi government should own the information campaign against Daesh in Iraq. I've mentioned the need to sort of connect what's happening on the operation to the people who are doing the battle of the narrative. And people have got to work hard on this. I mean, one organisation who I think at the tactical level have got the right idea, and I'm not a paid advocate for them, is the British Army. Because in this new formation 77 Brigade, they've created something which is specifically designed to fill this gap, but also create the gearing between the deployable forces and the battle for the narrative. I'd like to think that there are some highly paid, highly motivated, very busy people who are out there trying to construct these battles of the narrative. I'm not sure. And I was rather underwhelmed by an announcement by the Foreign and Commonwealth Office that they'd set up a Twitter account to combat Daesh about a year after the fall of Mosul. What does appear to me to be happening is there does appear in the Muslim world to be self-starting examples of people who are contesting this. There's a number of comics, stand-up comics, who are taking the Mickey of Daesh. There's a number of moderate imams. And as another example, a week ago I was in the Grand Mosque in Oman. Now I don't say that to impress you with my air miles, but after touring the Grand Mosque, the tour guides actually would take people into a rather nice sort of ante-room and saying, would you like to have a conversation about the true nature of Islam? And what they were very keen to do was to message the positive, peaceful, civilized aspects of Islam, as opposed to, you know, Daesh, which they regarded as having gone beyond the pale. And it's in its own sort of limited way, it was a progressive step. What I think this means for military headquarters is military headquarters are going to have, alongside, you know, their cell that does engineers and their cell that does air, or their cell that does force protection, they've got to have a battle for the narrative cell. And furthermore, the battle of the narrative can't be regarded as something for the second 11. It's got to be mainstream commander stuff. The final idea I'd offer is I do wonder if the resources of the advertising and marketing industry are being leveraged. Because advertising and marketing is itself a battle for the narrative, and it washes past us every day as we go about our business. And there is an advertising and marketing industry, you know, in the Middle East, and has the brain power and the motivation and the understanding and the nous of those people leveraged against Daesh. I'm not sure it has.
Interesting point around the security as a whole of society task, really, that you're making here. There's a question in the first row. If we can get a microphone right over here.
My name is Kamil from Kayhan London Magazine. The nature of battling in Syria and Iraq is different, but my question is going back to Quds Force movement in Syria and in Iraq. After the long time Qasem Soleimani, who managed the battling in Iraq, now we see him in Syria. Do you see a Quds Force movement different in Syria or Iraq, or using in the same strategy?
Thank you for that.
That's a very good question. Well, what we do know is, after the fall of Mosul, Grand Ayatollah al-Sistani in Iraq issued what was effectively interpreted as a call for arms, although he subsequently issued another fatwa saying this must not be sectarian, and you know we must not repress Iraq's Sunni minority. But this led to what the Iraqi government and the militias themselves has called to a mass popular mobilization of Shia militias. And it's my judgment that that was just as important in stopping ISIS's headlong rush towards northern Baghdad as the US coalition-led airstrikes. Many of those militias seem to be militias with whom Iran has had cordial relations and have had a degree of sponsorship. And I was astonished when I saw, you know, Qasem Soleimani starting to pose for selfies and appearing on people's Twitter accounts. But there's no doubt that Iranian advice, Iranian arms and ammunition, and deployment of Iranian officers, you know, including senior officers from the Quds Force who've been killed both in Syria and Iraq, has made a difference, and it shows the value of, you know, advisors who are prepared to go to the front line and get themselves in harm's way in working to improve what a militia does. Of course, the difficulty is, in terms of the coalition aims of restoring the status quo ante in Iraq, of a unified Iraq, in which the Sunni minority is properly treated, you know, this plays directly into ISIS's narrative that the Iraqi government is inherently Shia and sectarian and a puppet of Iran. Well, we'll see how it plays out, but quite clearly Qasem Soleimani is still, you know, very active close to the front line, as shown by these Twitter postings. It has led to a rather interesting phenomenon that M1 Abrams tanks coming out of refurbishment of the Iraqi Army's armoured vehicle depot have had their US 50 caliber machine guns taken off, and they've actually had Iranian manufactured machine guns firing Iranian ammunition put on top. I think what this also illustrates is that, you know, the political circumstances that might somehow bring an end to these two interlinked but dreadful wars, they do require, if you like, a strategic alignment that involves Iran. I'm sorry I can't be more optimistic, but as a military professional, I look at what Quds Force has been doing, both in, if you like, the war against the coalition forces in the previous decade, Iraq, and now with great professional interest. Not necessarily its aims, but certainly, the organisation and the way it does it.
Thank you, Ben. A couple of questions now. Let's start here in the front row, here immediately in front of me. Then we'll go to the back to you, sir, and then there was another question over here.
Jonathan Katzenellenbogen, member of the Institute. Just looking at the situation in the Russian situation in Syria, in many respects they would be on the other side. They fought a hybrid war in Ukraine and Crimea, but on the other hand, in Syria, they're fighting a fairly, what would seem a conventional war so far as we know. In many respects, a bombing campaign to pave the way for Iranian and Syrian and Cuban ground forces, apparently. So you're seeing, the full range of their capabilities here. And my question is, what would be the efficacy of their bombing campaign? Apparently, it's there was a very good report in the Sunday Times over the weekend saying this is very well planned with Syrian advisors. They don't bomb mosques even if there's a hint of their enemy's activity there, and it seems to be quite politically sensitive so far as this article. But I'd be interested in your opinion on the effectiveness of an aerial bombing campaign. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Ben, do you want to take a crack at that?
Well, it's still work in progress. Presumably they have benefited from months of intelligence gathering, surveillance and reconnaissance, and also building on such intelligence as the Syrian government forces. So many of the targets they've attacked were probably well-known targets, well-known rebel arms dumps, supply posts, command posts, training areas, and so on. Having taken those, as the battlefield becomes more fluid, their information may become less useful, although they've obviously deployed drones, and they would appear to have deployed some electronic warfare, and I'd imagine signals intelligence aspects. What's difficult to assess is the degree of civilian casualties and collateral damage. Bearing in mind, of course, the rebels will always talk up civilian casualties and collateral damage. There is some evidence I've seen that this initial push to take advantage of the airstrikes has certainly been met by a pretty fierce rebel defence, including extensive use of TOW missiles, with whom the anti-tank missiles, with whom the rebels have been supplied. I think we'll have to wait and see, Jonathan.
Ben, thank you. Let's group, if it's all right, let's group the next three questions together. Gentleman here by the aisle. Yes, right there. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Sean Mahlasela, a student at RCDS. I would want to understand that it seems to me that the lines of communication of the ISIL are wide and they are fighting in many fronts. What would give the coalition forces advantage in cutting of those lines, and is coalition forces aware of what lines of communication should they be concentrating on? Thank you.
Thank you very much. Next question, fourth row, I think, yes.
Neil Sexton, also from the Royal College of Defence Studies. First, a comment. I'm not absolutely convinced of the terminology hybrid warfare. I'm not entirely sure what is different about this modernised, conventional blend of warfare from the sort of warfare in 1939 to 45 that amalgamated propaganda, some espionage, special operations executive commando forces, and the nascent SAS. What's different really in this new conventional warfare that uses all of those things? But my question then leads on to say, in your sales pitch for renewed effort in land combined arms tactics, I am just concerned that some of those weapons we have previously used in Western armies would now probably be unacceptable to politicians and the members of the public, and dumb indirect fire would be quite high on the top of that list. What would you say?
Thank you very much. And finally, in this round, here in the first row, sir.
Hello, Phil Eyre, I'm a member of the Institute as well. I'm interested in the battle of the narrative, Ukraine, and the phrase Ukraine and Crimea. To the extent that words are weapons, and we are ourselves propagators of words, is the pervasive use of that phrase, Ukraine and Crimea, an indication of how we have been damaged by and perpetuate the damage of the opposite narrative?
Well, I'll deal with that last question first. The answer has to be yes. And again, it is something you see in marketing and advertising, and also everyday politics in the United Kingdom and the United States. So you do have a point. I mean, another issue is whether you call ISIS ISIS or call it Daesh. Daesh is the term that's used extensively by governments and the media throughout the region. It's the term I prefer, but actually I find ISIS rolls better off my tongue. But yeah, you've got a very good point. The two gentlemen from the Royal College of Defence Studies, it's great to see you here, and the Royal College of Defence Studies really is an excellent organisation. Your point about the definition of hybrid warfare is a very good one, and indeed the Second World War included a number of episodes of simultaneous different types of conflict going on in different theatres, and it's not nearly as simple as the massed army state-on-state clash that is often portrayed. That's also applied to many other wars in history. Yes, the West likes to feel that its technology is increasingly discriminate and reduces the possibility of civilian casualties and collateral damage. There is still a role for unguided munitions, be it the armour-piercing shell fired by a tank gun, a sniper rifle, or indeed conventional artillery. And indeed, if we look at Libya, there was quite a noble period when a Royal Navy destroyer engaged fire with Libyan shore batteries, which were out in the open, and I think fired about 250 rounds of main gunfire over a period of several nights. And indeed, until someone produces a significant reduction in cost of precision munitions, I think armed forces, or for that matter navies and air forces, are always going to want to have a mix of ultra-precise and probably very expensive munitions, somewhat precise munitions, and old-fashioned unguided munitions, because there will still be opportunities for using the unguided munitions. And indeed, there have been several pitched battles fought by British infantry in Afghanistan, where they've actually dug in and defended against waves and waves of Taliban attacks, where you saw precisely this mix from 81mm mortar bombs, 105mm mortar bombs, precision artillery, precision fire from attack helicopters and closed air support, and a variety of other sophisticated rockets and missiles used. And I think the British armed forces and Western armed forces need to be quite robust in defending their need for some old-fashioned systems. The first question from the RCDS student. Yes, attacking lines of communication and trying to cut off terrorist supply lines, of course, is a classic tactic of counterinsurgents and government forces. And it's always complicated, as it was, for example, for the coalition in Iraq, when you can't close off the borders. The coalition never really closed off the Syrian or the Iraqi borders of Iraq, in the Syrian or Iranian borders of Iraq in the previous decade. Having said that, it would seem to me pretty obvious that there was a great deal more that Turkey could have done to close its border. And whether it's doing enough right now, I'm not entirely convinced. And the other thing you've got with ISIS's fundraising operations, kidnapping, smuggling of oil, and smuggling of antiquities, is you've got, again, the negative effect of bribery and corruption. Because you can have as powerful a border fence and a ditch as you want, and as elaborate a sort of customs post, but if you can actually bribe your way through it to get the antiquities or the smuggled oil out, it'll get through. So that argues, again, for a comprehensive approach. And it also probably argues for assistance to the frontline states, which aren't just Turkey, they're also Jordan and Saudi Arabia, to help them maintain security of their borders. And I would hope that the Iranian government is on top of its border with Iraq as well.
Ben, thank you very much. I don't see any further questions. There's one all the way in the back.
Yeah.
Yes, please. Sorry, I didn't see you there.
Brooks Newmark, who's a member and has spent 10 years going back and forth to Syria. I just came back from meeting with representatives from the 12 largest groups in Turkey, in fact, who have been rebel groups, non-Islamic. And as much that we talk about IS, the reality on the ground is that he who commands the skies is creating most of the deaths. And over 95% of the deaths, of the 250,000 odd deaths, have been created by Assad, and about 1% by IS. And we seem to be getting obsessed with what may be an existential threat or not. But again, the evidence is that the bombings that have taken place in the past week or so, again, have been primarily against rebel forces, and rebel forces, not IS. And I'm just sort of curious as to, tactically, what you think Assad is up to. Is he trying to reinforce his narrative that he is fighting terrorists, real terrorists, those that we view as terrorists, IS, by getting rid of what would be legitimate opposition, which is the FSA, who we have consistently failed to support over the past 4 years?
Thank you very much. Ben, before you answer that, there was another question, the other side of the end of the room. Let's get that one in as well, and then you can take them together.
Good evening. My name is James Sladden. I work for RAND Europe, but I'm speaking in personal capacity, and I also worked in eastern Ukraine as a monitor during the conflict. I just wanted to draw your attention to, in addition to your observations, one extra aspect of what Russia was doing out there, which is the Joint Control and Coordination Center, which is uniformed Russian military officers combined with uniformed Ukrainian military officers in a monitoring role, military monitoring role, as part of Minsk I, which adds, if you like, another element to what they're doing out there, in addition to all the rest of it, if you like, an above-board and legitimate monitoring role, which allowed them to operate in that area. And so my question to that extent, actually, is to what extent would you agree that our adversaries have, if you like, and I share the other speakers' sort of disdain for hybrid, but have developed both a military capability and indeed military concepts of ways of working, which actually we don't possess. We are almost unable to work or think in this way. Granted that 7-7 might be a first stab, but it's really not at a high enough level.
Thank you very much. Ben, why don't you take those two, and we'll close the list there. Two big questions towards the end again.
I'll start with the last question. Well, the one thing I would say, there's no doubt that Joint Coordination Centre and the work of the OSCE has at times reduced the intensity of the conflict and saved lives. It has allowed civilians to be evacuated. It has arranged for the lifting of mines to allow various humanitarian activities. And as someone who had a very walk-on part in the war in Bosnia, I salute the positive things that has been achieved by that and the OSCE. Your point about, do our potential opponents think differently from us and therefore develop different capabilities? Well, yes, they do. I mean, the operation to take over the Crimea, seems to have been quite an imaginative operation that caught the Ukrainian government, the Western media, and indeed, many key NATO members on the back foot. And at the risk of boring you, I'd return to my worked example, which is Quds Force. The UK and NATO, over the last 15 years, has often struggled to deliver a comprehensive and interagency approach. But in Quds Force, you have an organisation that inherently is comprehensive and interagency. And I think, people ought to sit up and take notice of that. The only other thing I'd say about RAND is RAND has done some very good reporting of the war, and I would particularly commend to all of you a report that was written by Linda Robinson in the middle of the year based on a field trip that she did and her subsequent testimony on the Hill. You can't do much better than that. I'd also commend the last but one questioner, Brooks Newmark, because I don't think there's anyone in Westminster who knows more about this terrible conflict and has done more to keep it in the public eye. So thank you very much for that, Brooks, and also for your question. The point you make, I think, is absolutely spot on. And it's a very difficult question, this. It's a question about, responsibility for death and destruction on a scale that we haven't seen in the UK since the English Civil War. The one thing I'd take away as a sort of general military lesson is, again, it's this business of, can you do attribution? Can you take, intelligence and other, and indeed open source stuff, and can you quickly turn it round in a way that produces a convincing smoking gun? And that is another challenge for government and also for foreign offices and intelligence agencies. But to my mind, the thing I take away is the fundamental importance of linking the battle of the narrative with the core activity of what you're going to try to achieve. But I'm sorry I haven't got any easier answers.
Ben, thank you very much. And thank you all for your many questions that made for a stimulating conversation. I think the issue of whether or not hybrid warfare is the perfect term. It's certainly not the perfect term, but I think we feel that it is a useful term for the phenomenon that we're trying to describe. But I think the point that our colleague from RAND raised does underline that the boundaries between peace and war are indeed very difficult to come to terms with at the moment, and we might not at the moment be well positioned to understand them, at least not as well as some of our opponents do. So I'm sure there's lots of more useful work that can be done around this. But we started 2 minutes late, so it's only fair that we shall close at 7:02. So I'll thank you all for coming, for your many questions, but most of all, I'd like to thank Ben for leading us through this conversation, which I thought was fascinating and indeed had in itself a very high utility. And so let's all give Ben a round of applause, please, and thank him the usual way. Thank you, Ben.